The trail camera blinks awake at 2:47 a.m. It catches movement, a shifting mass crossing a dry creek bed on the Nueces River plain of South Texas, southwest of San Antonio, where mesquite grows thick as a wall. The date stamp reads October 2021. The footage is grainy, infrared green, but the shapes are unmistakable. Dozens of them. Moving like a single organism through the darkness, rooting and grunting, turning a stretch of riverbank that was intact that afternoon into something resembling a construction site hit by a flash flood. Cole Mercer watches this footage at his kitchen table, boots still on, coffee going cold. He's been running cameras on the Hawkins property for 3 years. He's seen a lot. But the next clip stops him cold. It isn't the hogs, it's what's watching them. At the edge of the frame, crouched low in the dried grass, is a mountain lion, a big one. It stays motionless for 11 minutes, watching the herd pass. When the last piglet trails through the creek bed, it follows, silent, deliberate, like it knows exactly where this is going. Cole has spent 15 years tracking wildlife across South Texas brush country. He knows what a hunting cat looks like. This one isn't just passing through, it's learning a route. What he doesn't know yet is that this moment is a small window into something much larger, something quietly building for decades beneath the noise of one of the most expensive ecological disasters in American history. Here on AgriFlow Daily, that's exactly the kind of story we follow, where the land, the animals, and the people who work it collide in ways nobody saw coming. To understand what he's seeing, you have to go back, further than most people expect. In 1493, Columbus's second voyage brought the first domestic pigs to Hispaniola. By the 1500s, Spanish explorers were releasing herds across the American Southwest and Gulf Coast as walking food supplies. Hernando de Soto crossed the Mississippi in 1539 with 13 pigs. He died before completing his expedition. His pigs did not. They scattered into the bottomlands of the South and never stopped multiplying. Some historians call it the most consequential unintended ecological event in North American history. For centuries, the population remained patchy and manageable. Then the 20th century introduced a second wave. Beginning in the 1930s and accelerating through the 1970s and 80s, landowners and hunting preserves across Texas and the South began importing Eurasian wild boar, larger, leaner, more aggressive, as game animals. Inevitably, they escaped. When they interbred with existing feral populations, the result was a hybrid that combined the reproductive rate of a domestic sow with the hardiness, intelligence, and ecological flexibility of a wild species shaped by thousands of years of wilderness. By 1988, wildlife biologists were noticing that something had changed. Populations that had been localized were spreading. By the mid-1990s, feral hogs were documented in nearly every county in Texas. By 2005, estimates placed the state population between 1.5 and 2 million animals. Wildlife managers responded with trapping programs, aerial gunning, bounties, and expanded hunting seasons. Millions of hogs were removed. The population kept growing. Today, the numbers are staggering. Texas alone supports an estimated 2.5 to 3 million feral hogs. Across the United States, from the Gulf Coast marshes of Louisiana to the longleaf pine forests of Georgia to the river bottoms of Oklahoma and Arkansas, the population sits somewhere between 6 and 9 million animals, the largest invasive large mammal outbreak ever recorded on the North American continent. The annual damage to crops, infrastructure, water quality, and native wildlife runs roughly $2.5 billion. Texas absorbs hundreds of millions of that figure alone. A single sounder can destroy 40 acres of corn or sorghum between dusk and dawn, rooting up not just the grain, but the soil itself, leaving fields that look like they've been rototilled by something that hates them. Across South Texas, ranchers report broken fences, contaminated stock tanks, and disrupted cattle operations. In the wetlands and river bends, the damage shows up as stripped vegetation, collapsing banks, and water that runs brown where it once ran clear. The hogs eat everything. And in Texas, with its mild winters, endless brush cover, and vast patchwork of private ranches where coordinated control is nearly impossible, food is everywhere. A female can begin reproducing at 6 to 8 months, producing 2 litters per year, averaging 4 to 6 piglets each. Wildlife managers estimate that holding Texas populations stable would require removing 70% of the population annually. Currently, roughly half that is being achieved. The gap between removal and reproduction is where the crisis lives. This is where most stories about feral hogs stop. The problem is too big. Move on. But Cole Mercer doesn't stop. Because that trail camera footage keeps pulling at him. Over the following 8 months, Cole reviews hundreds of clips from cameras across 4 ranches. The mountain lion appears again and again. Different locations, different creek crossings, different hours of the night. By February 2022, he's documented it at 7 separate sites. In March, he finds a carcass, a subadult hog, roughly 40 pounds, dragged into a stand of tasajillo cactus and partially consumed. Kill marks consistent with mountain lion predation. Puncture wounds to the skull, characteristic feeding pattern of a large felid. Then a second carcass, a third. In May, tracks suggest a second adult lion following the same primary pig movement corridor. Cole brings his footage and field notes to researchers at Texas A&M. What follows isn't a revelation so much as a confirmation of something scientists had long suspected, but never had the field data to prove at this scale. Mountain lions across the American Southwest and South Texas have historically fed on white-tailed deer as their primary prey, supplemented by smaller mammals, javelinas, and occasional livestock. But GPS collar studies from the early 2010s onward began revealing anomalies. Scat analyses at several South Texas study sites, the painstaking process of identifying prey remains in cougar droppings, showed pig remains appearing with striking frequency. At some locations, wild pigs were showing up in cougar scat nearly as often as deer. Researchers began building a picture from multiple data streams. Kill sites identified via GPS clustering show a notable proportion occurring along the same drainage corridors feral hog sounders use regularly. Trail camera networks document lions tracking pig routes, with a consistency that suggests learned behavior rather than opportunistic encounters. Younger lions, subadults recently dispersed from their mothers, appear most often at pig kill sites, suggesting this hunting behavior is being acquired during the critical learning window of early adulthood. What researchers are documenting is behavioral adaptation in real time. For most of the 20th century, Texas mountain lions had no exposure to feral hogs at modern densities. Now, the landscape is full of a prey species that is abundant, protein-rich, and, particularly in younger age classes, relatively vulnerable to ambush predation. Unlike white-tailed deer, which are alert and difficult to stalk in open country, Feral hog sounders are loud, predictable in their movement, and often distracted by rooting. For a sit-and-wait ambush predator, they are, in some ways, a near-ideal target. Lions that learn to exploit pig corridors and use the thick South Texas brush for short explosive sprints are discovering a food source that simply didn't exist for their parents. This is not, researchers are careful to note, a solution. A mountain lion kills roughly one large prey animal per week. Texas supports an estimated 500 to a few thousand cougars. Against 2.5 to 3 million hogs, they are a whisper against a roar. But something else is happening that the numbers alone don't capture. And this is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. A report written by a wildlife parasitologist in 2019 went virtually unnoticed outside of a tiny group of disease ecologists. It documented something quietly accumulating in the data for years. As feral hog densities increased, internal parasites, particularly metastron-gylus lungworms and gastrointestinal helminths, were reaching extraordinary prevalence rates in some Texas populations. In high-density areas, nearly every adult hog examined carried significant parasite burdens. The parasites rarely kill their hosts, but they degrade body condition, reproductive efficiency, and immune function. A heavily parasitized sow doesn't always produce maximum litters. Compound this with pseudorabies virus, near universally fatal to dogs, causing reproductive failure in cattle and mortality in other wild mammals, along with brucellosis, leptospirosis, and swine influenza variants, and the picture shifts. Dense hog populations aren't simply an ecological problem. They're a disease reservoir under mounting biological pressure, and that pressure intensifies as densities increase. It's the classic paradox of invasive species biology. Success becomes its own constraint. The more you thrive, the more you invite the forces that eventually stabilize a population. Nature has done this before. It always does. Down on the Texas Gulf Coast, in the marsh country east of Houston and along the tidal flats of the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, a different kind of pressure is accumulating. American alligators, rebounding steadily since federal protection began in 1970, have been documenting an unexpected pattern in long-term monitoring surveys. Hog tracks and rooting sign along water edges are common throughout the region. And increasingly, wildlife observers and camera traps have been recording what can only be described as ambush predation. Alligators taking piglets and juvenile hogs at water crossings, at stock tank edges, at the points where pig movement corridors intersect permanent water. An alligator doesn't chase prey, it waits. And the predictable movement patterns of feral hogs along water edges are, for a patient ambush predator, an invitation. Further north, in the recovering bottomland forests of East Texas and the pine forests of the Piney Woods region, black bears, slowly expanding their range back into historical habitat after a century of near extirpation, are beginning to intersect with feral hog populations. The interaction is complex. Black bears and feral hogs compete intensely for mast, acorns, pecans, wild fruits, and the hogs, more aggressive and present in far greater numbers, often dominate. But bears are opportunistic omnivores with a particular advantage. They can and do consume feral hog piglets when they find them, and they will scavenge hog carcasses with enthusiasm. As bear populations inch back into East Texas, they are entering an ecosystem that now contains more food in the form of feral hogs than it has in living memory. 3 predators, 1 disease complex, 1 food web gradually rewiring itself around an invasive species that human management alone cannot remove. Cole Mercer stands on a limestone ridge above the Nueces drainage on a January morning in 2024, watching a sounder of 16 hogs work through a dry creek bed 300 yards below. 3 months ago, he watched a mountain lion follow this exact corridor 4 nights in a row. 2 weeks ago, his trail camera caught a second younger lion, a subadult male, probably 2 or 3 years old, using the same route. A student following a lesson that was never formally taught. Here is what the numbers don't say. Texas and the southern United States spent more than a century systematically removing mountain lions from the landscape, shot, trapped, poisoned, and bounty hunted across virtually their entire range. By the mid-20th century, cougars had been eliminated from most of the eastern United States and severely reduced across the South. Their removal didn't just affect the cats, it simplified food webs. It erased the top-down predation pressure that, over millennia, had shaped the behavior and distribution of prey populations across the landscape. Into that predator-reduced ecosystem, feral hogs expanded with almost nothing to slow them. So, the government spent tens of millions fighting an invasion that began, in no small part, because it had already spent generations creating the conditions for one. What nobody planned, what no agency designed, no manager proposed, no legislation mandated, is what's happening now. A recovering predator, following the logic of survival, discovering an abundant new prey source and incorporating it into its hunting repertoire. A disease ecology intensifying quietly inside dense populations until it begins exerting its own pressure. A fragmented, imperfect biological resistance that is not winning, has never been close to winning, but is doing something that $2.5 billion of annual human management has not achieved. It is making the feral hog pay a continuous, accumulating cost simply for existing. No truck, no helicopter, no trap, no toxicant operates every night of the year. A mountain lion does. The story of feral hogs in Texas has been told, for most of the last 30 years, as a story about human beings trying to solve a problem and failing. That story is true as far as it goes, but it is not the only story happening on this land. Underneath the noise of the invasion, underneath the rooting and the grunting and the crop losses and the broken fences and the clouded water, something older and slower and far more patient is in motion. The land is not passive. It is not waiting for people to fix what people broke. It is doing what it has always done, across every invasion and extinction and recovery in its long and complicated history. It is finding a new arrangement. Whether that arrangement is enough, whether predators and parasites and disease ecology and the accumulating cost of biological existence will ever meaningfully bend the feral hog population curve in Texas, is a question that nobody can honestly answer. The biology suggests it is possible. The timeline is uncertain. The outcome, as it almost always is in ecology, remains genuinely open. The young mountain lion on Cole's trail camera appears again on the evening of January 17, 2024. It is following a sounder of 14 hogs through a dry drainage east of the Hawkins property boundary. It tracks them for almost a mile. Then it stops, crouches, and waits at a bend in the creek where the brush closes in and the hogs will have to slow down. The camera timestamps the footage at 10:43 p.m. It is watching. It is learning. It is doing what its kind has done for millions of years, adapting to whatever the world has become. That footage is still on Cole's hard drive. He watches it sometimes when he's trying to explain to people why this story isn't over, why it was never just about the hogs. If you found this story worth following, the kind that doesn't end with easy answers,